Alright, everyone. So today we're going to continue talking about the way West, but this time we're going to go through the Wests in fact and in fantasy. And if you think about it, a lot of things that are distinctly American traits came from this traveling the way West, like cowboys and Indians, the log cabins on the frontier, the Oregon Trail, for those of you that are old enough to actually remember that game. A lot of these things that are distinctly American came from the traveling westward. So by the 1830s, Europeans began to realize that Americans were a lot different from their European counterparts and became kind of a different American species. So what caused these changes? What made them different and how were they different? The question was important to understand because the nature of Americans was tied to the nature of their politics. The rising politicians like Jackson and William Henry Harrison understood how to get American votes and ride the wave of popular support into the White House. The losing politicians were people who couldn't figure out how to get those American voters on their side and how to ride that wave of popular support. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner presented his frontier theory or frontier thesis of American history as a way of explaining American national character. He took one characteristic of all of the American experience that wasn't in Europe, the wilderness or the frontier, to explain how we were different. Turner argued that the frontier changed these Europeans into Americans. As people came into contact with the wilderness, they became more cooperative, more democratic, more self-reliant, and freer than the Europeans that they were before the experience. The frontier molded people, and in the process molded American culture. People were transformed as part of the process of the transformation of the wilderness. Now, not all of the facts fit the theory very well. The frontier did have an effect on people, but not necessarily the one that Turner imagined. One big question has to do with why Americans went west in the first place. Turner said that they went to bring civilization. They were frontiersmen advancing civilization or trying to escape from it. We have already talked about Sam Houston, who used the frontier to escape from civilization. But was he unique? Not really. Folks like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett spent most of their lives trying desperately to stay a few miles and a few months ahead of civilization's advance west. When things got too crowded, Daniel and Davy pulled up stakes and moved again. The point is that frontiersmen had lots of different reasons for moving west, and none of them were likely to have been to help Professor Turner coin a hypothesis about American character. We'll look at two images of the frontier folks and see what that process was like. First, we'll look at the mountain men and the fur frontier and try to sort out the myth from the reality. And then we'll look at the Trail West and one of its most famous wagon trains and do the same thing. The image of the mountain man, among them on the rare occasion when they come together, there's a rough equality and a mountain democracy amongst them. When he is alone, the mountain man is in his element. He is independent, free, self-reliant, and alone against the elements of the wilderness. This is the image perpetrated by writers, movies, and TV, and this is the myth of the mountain man. The real life of the trapper was very different. From their earliest existence, fur men kept to one golden rule in mind: their safety in numbers. Fur trappers didn't go anywhere alone. A lonely trapper was a dead trapper. They moved in large groups, called fur brigades, large armed base camps. They had to defend themselves from Indians, or in some areas against British soldiers and competitors, and from other American fur brigades. So much for the rugged individualism. But how about independence and free enterprise? Fur was big business. Trappers were employed by fur companies that did all they could to discourage free enterprise. The greatest magnate of the fur business was John Jacob Astor, president of the American Fur Company. In 1812 he founded his fur company, and it was so big that trappers simply referred to it as the company. The U.S. government used a system called the factory system to trade furs with Indians. Under the factory system, furs were traded at a fixed price to protect the Indians. This cost Astor money, so in 1822, Astor was able to get Congress to take it away. Astor wanted to pay less for furs and sell his trade goods for a higher price to the Indians. Astor encouraged an illegal trade in whiskey with them. He watered the whiskey and traded it with Indians at a markup on whiskey of about 6,000%. He was a shrewd businessman. For Astor, competition was horrible. It was unprofitable. He was known to hire Indians to attack rival fur trappers. He made profits of about $1 million a year at the height of the fur market. About 1 year before the fashion for beaver fur hats gave way to silk, Astor sold the business. At his death, he was worth $20 million. Trappers were dependent on a system that stretched from the mountains, where the fur was, to St. Louis, to New York, to Europe, where the demand for fur top hats were. The turnaround for profit on beaver fur was almost 2 years, so the trapper needed the fur company, and the fur company needed the trapper. But trappers always got the short end of the deal. They needed supplies, and the companies were happy to provide their employees with the best, at about a 2,000% markup. Many trappers went into debt, and like sharecroppers, spent the rest of their short lives trapping to pay them off. Debtor trappers had to agree to work for only one company at whatever the price that company paid. In addition, trappers often began their careers beholden to a company. Because the startup cost to become a trapper was high, you needed traps, rifles, supplies, and all of that stuff cost money. So who were these trappers? Did they look and act like the Robert Redfords and Charlton Hestons that portray them in the movies? Evidence suggests that the fur frontier drew from the fringes of society. Sociopaths. People who possessed qualities that were likely to get them hanged in Philadelphia were survival quantities in the mountains. There is an element here of what has been called the way west as a safety valve. People couldn't make it in the stratified, law-abiding East, went west where the more lawless aspects of their character were a plus instead of a liability to them. But to sum up, the myth of the independent fur trapper living alone and free in the wilderness is just that, a myth. The fur frontier was a business, and the trapper was a worker at the bottom of a multinational, multi-million-dollar business. This was often true for the frontiers, and it was also true of the farming frontier too. Farming the West was made possible first by canals like the Erie and others that connected western Pennsylvania and New York with the eastern seaboard. Later, the railroads supported and were enriched by these western farmers. Pioneering was unhealthy and dangerous. Indians, illness, and cures were all very lethal. Many trappers lived like Indians. They married Indian women, ate Indian delicacies like bear's liver and sometimes the liver of other species that often walked on two legs. They took and lost scalps, drank buffalo blood. Trappers were a rare breed in this respect, and most pioneers feared and despised Indians. Health is another one of those places where the West is romanticized. In the movies, pioneers absolutely glow with good health. Settlers were pretty much ignorant about how to stay healthy and about medicine. Sickness went west with a vengeance, and what cures there were in the first half of the 19th century stayed east. Malaria was everywhere, west and south. There is no cure for it, but it can be treated with quinine, which there was in the east and in the south, but not in the west. Typhoid fever was also prevalent. Most western communities' garbage disposal took place just out the back door. Surface water provided drinking water, which led to typhoid. There was also rheumatism, scarlet fever, diphtheria, smallpox, tetanus, and pneumonia. Lots of people just died from rotten teeth or pink eye. Asiatic cholera traveled from Philadelphia to the Rockies in 1830. Insects contributed their share to the human misery in the West as well. Mosquitoes, fleas, bedbugs, spiders, some like the black widow that could kill, and others that had bites that could make folks anywhere from sore to miserable. The common housefly flourished, and of course all manner of snakes. Some Indian cures helped, but most Western cures didn't. For some diseases, people took mercury, rolled up in spider webs, or horse dung. There were frontier doctors, but not many. Usually frontier doctors had either been chased west for malpractice, or they had studied a little medicine under a real doctor. The saying went that on the frontier you had a 50-50 chance if you got very sick. 50% to die from the ailment, 50% to die from the cure. All in all, the way west was tough no matter why you went. But it still remains that the West was populated. And next, we're going to look at the wagon train in the way west. So, the next question after acquisition is population. How will the United States populate the West? You have all heard the story in movies and in the TV series, and the great wagon trains over the trails heading for new lands and settlement and farms, new opportunities in the West. The movies always like to focus on the dangers, the desert, the snakes, the Indians. These are the obvious ones. But there were others that weren't so obvious, and gave the first bunch little help in raising the death toll. These were the bad information and just plain stupidity. People were probably killed by the desire to cut a few days off of their journey more than snakes. For sure, Indians probably. So we'll look at the Donner Party as a case study. The Donner family came from Springfield, Illinois, and they desired to move to California. Most of the party that had collected around the Donners were pretty well-off people. The poor didn't buy wagons and move west. If they went at all, they worked their way west. Donner had read guides published by land speculators about how to get to California. These books pointed out that California was a sort of New Eden, where crops grew better than anywhere else, it was warm all year round, the usual propaganda to get people to go somewhere. The party prepared itself poorly for the trip. One family group, for instance, had purchased 3 wagons, one for the family, one for the supplies, and a third to carry just about everything they owned that would move: beds, dressers, mirrors, books, booze, furniture, a piano, etc. The party began the trip overloaded in the first place. They met at Independence, Missouri. Here they decided not to hire a trail boss, but to choose one of their own party to lead them west. There were lots of men available to work as guides and general trail bosses who knew what they were doing, but they were expensive, and the Donners had read the guides, so why waste money on someone to act as a guide and push the party members around? On the first day out, the party ran into a disagreement. The party had elected a Colonel Russell as their boss. Wagons began to break off from the group for various reasons. Russell was fired and rehired, more arguments ensued, organization of the wagons began to take a toll on the speed of the party's travel. It was spring on the eastern plains, and the party dawdled along the trail. They stopped to see the sights. They slowed down to avoid making a lot of dust, that out of consideration for the wagons in the rear and that had to eat it. They should have been moving as quickly as possible during this leg of the trip, and they weren't. Most wagon trains were poorly disciplined, except for the Santa Fe freight trains and the Mormon trains, the latter because the Mormon trail bosses had the authority of God Almighty and weren't afraid to use it to keep discipline. Movies always show wagons traveling in these neat single-file lines. Except for the cases mentioned above, the Santa Fe freight and the Mormons, this rarely ever happened. Wagons tended to spread out. There was no road, just a broad plain, so to avoid eating the dust of the next guy in front of you, you moved to the side. The whole train might be spread out across a 2-mile area by the end of the day. So, at night, it might take hours to get all the wagons in one place for the night where the wagons were circled. Indians attacked stragglers. If you strayed too far from the train, you would quickly get an opportunity to meet the interesting local natives and become dead. Indians would attack a straggling wagon, a lone rider, or stray livestock, but not a close-knit, well-organized train. The movie image of Indians riding in circles around a circled train, graciously allowing everyone in the party to shoot at them, appeals to Hollywood directors considerably more than it did to the Indians. By mid-Nebraska, the land began to roll. Here the Donner Party split again. The strain was beginning to tell, and this began to lead to fights among the settlers. This is also the point when people started to die: the old, the ill, the very young, and the very stupid. Here also they began to get sick. The lack of fresh fruits and veggies caused scurvy. The heavy meat and flour-rich diet and the changing water supplies caused diarrhea. At about the Nebraska-Wyoming border, things began to get rougher. On this rough landscape, it might take a whole day to travel 500 yards. Often, wagons and teams had to be hauled across streams and ravines. The Donner Party fired Russell again at this point. They also began to drop stuff to lighten their load. They left behind their furniture, their books, anything that they decided that they could live without. They had by now arrived in desert sage country. It was hot, dry, and dusty. Their livestock began to die, and people did too. This is where the wagons began to turn back in earnest. Sometimes whole trains would give up and turn back. The Donners, however, went on. The party reached Fort Laramie. and this was the first stop on the trip. Here they could rest, repair, regroup, and resupply. From Fort Laramie, you could also see in the distance the Rocky Mountains. They looked pretty scary if you were planning to cross them in a wagon. So the Donners began to use their rest time looking at maps for a shortcut. Mountain men who were at the fort told the party not to leave the main trail, but the Donners ignored the advice of these dirty, hairy, buckskin-clad savages who knew the country like the backs of their hands. Now, Donner had read The Immigrant's Guide by Lansford Hastings. Hastings was a California land speculator, and he wrote the book to get people to go to California. The next stop after Laramie was Fort Hall. There, the distance from Oregon to California was about the same. So Hastings wrote about a shortcut to California, the Hastings Cutoff, that he assured settlers would cut several weeks off their trip to California. It should be pointed out, however, that Hastings didn't have a clue what he was talking about at the time he wrote the book. The cutoff would carry travelers between Fort Hall and the Great Salt Lake. What is there is vast expanses of desert. So at Fort Hall, the party split again. Several families followed the mountain men's advice and followed the trail. They lived to get to California. The Donners, however, cut southwest before Fort Hall and traveled to Fort Bridger that they left in August. From there, they took the Hastings Cutoff. They camped for 6 days in the Wasatch Mountains. On August 27th, they reached the Great Salt Lake. There, they began to die. At the south end of the Great Salt Lake, they ran across like this small stone tablet, the kind that settlers used to mark messages. This one had a message from Hastings. He had decided to try his cutoff and left message all along it telling travelers to turn back. The Salt Lake is 80 miles across. The Donners left half of their wagons on it. The party was running out of food. By November, the Donners had arrived in the Los Sierras. Indians had begun to kill the party's oxen. It was already snowing in the Rockies. Finally, the party bogged down in the snow in the Sierras. The shortcut had taken 3 months so far. 4 attempts were made to rescue the party from Sacramento. Before they were rescued, the survivors were forced to resort to cannibalism to survive, and it wasn't really as rare as we might think. 82 party members had survived the Hastings Cutoff as far as the Sierras, and some 4 months later, 47 of them were rescued. The point is, don't believe everything you read. So anyway, California became a slippery issue after the Mexican War, and even more so in the period from 1848 to 1850. When the Democratic National Convention met to select a presidential candidate in 1848, 2 different groups of delegates demanded to be seated, and credentials brawl broke out between the anti-slavery Democrats, which were also called the Barn Burners, and the regular Democrats. The Barn Burners left the convention, but they still left a divided party. Some key Southern delegates demanded that no candidates be considered who opposed slavery. When they failed to get their demands, they walked out of the convention. The remaining Democrats nominated Lewis Cass. The Democratic platform of 1848 was vague and issueless. Similarly, the Whigs had no real issues to present in their platform. They attacked the Democrats as a party, but presented no real issues to debate. Henry Clay was the clear choice of Southern Whigs, while Daniel Webster was the Northern choice. The party hacks, led by one Thurlow Weed, manipulated the Whig convention to win the nomination of Zachary Taylor. They expected that his military record would win him the White House. Taylor was a good choice. He was a national hero after the Mexican War and a slave owner. A third party appeared in the election of 1848 called the Liberty Party. Although this abolitionist party was more powerful and better supported than it had been, and was bolstered by the Barn Burners, it had no prayer of its succeeding because it had no support in the South. The Liberty Party was notable, however, because it was the only party to address any issues in the election. They opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories. They supported the expansion of free soil, which meant no slaves in the West so that free men could work the soil without unfree competition, and they demanded that the territories acquired in the Mexican War be free of slavery. They demanded free land for settlers, lower taxes, and internal improvements at the federal expense. In the election, lots of votes were cast for sectional reasons. Southern Whigs and Democrats united for Taylor. the Northern Democrats supported Cass. Once again, a North-South coalition, but this time not a party one, elected the president and Taylor won. There was no real change in the congressional makeup in the election, and so Congress got back to its usual bickering. By now, slavery dominated every issue. John Calhoun got busy during the period after the election trying to create a Southern pro-slavery political party that could carry the whole South against the Free Soil Northern Bloc. In short, the nation was beginning to unravel on the question of slavery. Some solution to the question of slavery and territorial expansion became more urgent when gold was discovered late in 1848 at Sutter's Mill in California. In 1848, there was about 14,000 people in California. About half of them were Anglo. Workers at a new mill site on the vast Sutter lands in California stumbled upon gold. The initial reaction of Californians was to stifle the news, but by late January of 1849, word got out, and within a few months, people from all over the world began to appear in California, eager to try their luck and get rich mining gold. The first effect of the gold rush was to give an enormous boost to the transportation industry. The money was not really in mining, but in miners. Commodore Vanderbilt made his first million transferring would-be miners from the East to California. Now at first, this frontier fit Turner's vision of equality on the frontier. There were lots of people and none of them had much of anything. Only a few of the first arrivals and some of those who were already there struck it rich. A larger number of people made a modest living panning gold. The average individual take from the mine fields in 1849 was about $20 a day, which was good. By 1850, it was $10 a day. By 1855, it was $3 a day. It was not a pleasant life, and the names of these mining towns reflected the general attitudes of the miners toward their circumstances. Some of them were called Hangtown, Dry Diggins, Skunk Gulch, just to name a few. Camps grew up that had the specific purpose of separating the miners from their gold. Mining towns had casinos, saloons, stores, and brothels, since 92% of the inhabitants of these gold towns were male. Prices skyrocketed. In a producing gold field, the price of a room was $1,000 a month. A dozen fresh eggs cost $10 in gold. A mug of beer that cost a nickel in Philadelphia went for $1 in a mining town. The service industry created fortunes for the service sector in the economy in California, in boom towns that grew up like mushrooms and around the main mining camps. Millions went back east in the national economy, depressed since the 1830s began to boom. The GNP in 1849 was $10 million. By 1852, it had risen to $81 million. Congress was pressed to admit California to statehood in order to provide order and government. Taylor requested that Congress admit California and was shocked when they refused to do it. The problem was that California was a military territory, not even a regular territory yet. And as a regular territory, California would have been expected to write a constitution and apply for statehood. But if it wrote a constitution, the question would crop up as to whether it would be a free state or a slave state. And here Congress balked. There was no real question that California would be a slave state. This would disturb the sectional balance in Congress, and this worried the South, and the political parties that staked their national strength on North-South alliances. Taylor decided to skip the territorial stage and move California directly to statehood. This didn't really solve the problem. Would it enter as a slave state or a free state? The South began to clamor for a decision. Calhoun's hand was strengthened. He formed committees of correspondence throughout the South. Southern states held conventions and called for petitions to address the California question. The issue drew support in the South from both Democrats and Whigs and began to threaten the solidarity of both parties. The disunity of the major parties in Congress gave the small, but unified, Free Soilers a great deal of power. Henry Clay began to fear disunion, so he worked out a compromise that he hoped would satisfy everyone. California would enter the Union as a free state. The New Mexicans would be able to decide for themselves whether they would be a free state or a slave state. The Washington, D.C. slave trade would be ended, and a new tough fugitive slave law was created that required northern states to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. We'll talk more about the Compromise of 1850 later, but the point is that the admission of California threatened the solidarity of the Union. And we'll talk about the lead up to the Civil War next time.